Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Payments Corner. I have Jacqueline and Klas Bäck again. We're going to keep going, talk a little deeper about some of the things. Today, we're going to talk about bins, and we're going to talk about fees, assessments, downgrades, whatever that means. They're going to help me figure that out. So I think that we kind of talked in the last episode about bins and how that could be used in kind of routing your transactions, where they need to go, for especially when it comes to debit routing and credit routing. But there's so much more that comes from bins. I know I use it to tell what type of card is being used on my site. I have some memorized. I won't say those here because I don't want to give those guys too much credit. But I think that there's even more that I don't know that I would love to know more. So, Klas, I'm going to start with you about what these bins mean, how you guys use them, and what me as a merchant should be learning and knowing from bins additionally. So.
Yeah, no, if we start from use cases, and I'm sure Jacqueline has even more from her years as a merchant, and probably the same for you. There are many ways that people can use the BIN data, so the 16 digits on a credit and a debit card. People are using it to draw insight about the consumer. As an example, is it valuable for your business to know that this is a premium card holder versus a preloadable card or a debit card, or does that make a difference in how you treat or classify these customers? So there's sort of a marketing or customer engagement component. People are using BIN data for basic fraud rules. That could be, as an example, I am not going to take transactions from these countries, or I am not going to take a non-reloadable prepaid card. Why? Because it has more chargeback statistically than other types, and in my business that doesn't make sense. So those are kind of common scenarios. And obviously you have the third one that you were mentioning for routing purposes. So where do I send which transaction? So three common use cases for where people are using BIN data.
So for me, like, I have in the past done basically like 3DS rules essentially. So targeting types of cards, more risky cards, I'll push through 3DS using BIN data. I tracked when I was at the world's largest ticketing company, BIN data in my chargeback reports every day. Now, some of that's interesting because you'll see bins on there that are like high net worth cards, but it's not necessarily that there's problems with those cards. It's just the consumer expectation that comes with those types of cards is different than someone that has a Wells Fargo debit card, for example. Like, I better be letting Amex Platinum people have a better time, essentially, is what it comes down to. But those are things that like you can use outside of just like riskiness, but you could find out, okay, what is the breakdown of customer expectation versus the reality of their situation for those types of things. So you can glean a lot from just that type of consumer. So Jacqueline, I'm sure you have a bunch of information too. Why don't you tell us all about bins?
Sure. I do think the use of bins is really helpful. We talked about two of them, fraud risk and just doing more for CRM or customer relationship purposes. There are relationships to be had from a co-marketing point of view that also is helpful to have bin data if you want to do anything where you're putting your information into the bank statement, that kind of thing. So there is lots of marketing examples of working with the card brands, and the bin data then becomes really important. Um, I do think there's changes happening, and having access to good bin data is tricky. It's honestly being one of those things where it's a bit hit or miss as to whether the bin that you type into a service is the gets you the right answer back. And it seems that having tested different bin services before, you get a per hit rate. Instead of 100% gives you the same answer every time, there is a hit rate as to whether they've updated their services regularly. And so I do think this is one place where Klas can tell us about it, because I know he answers these requests for quotes and needs responses from merchants. But like, what is it that makes a great bin service in order to be able to look up that bin and know exactly what product it is, which bank it's from, which country, and to decide whether or not to do business with it?
Yeah, how do you guys do that?
Well, I mean, I think there's two components for it. The first one is the industry changed their standard that's been around forever, which everyone was using 6 digits of the 16 for the standard in terms of how they use the BIN as such. Now that changed to 8, and sometimes when you do network tokens, you really should operate in 9 digits, but leaving that to the side, it is a shift last year from 8, so from 6 to 8. And if your vendor hasn't updated that information, you will be checking for a bin and you think it comes back as this issuer, but it may actually be a totally different issuer. It may even be an issuer in another country than the 6 digits returned. So if you're sending 6 versus 8, you get 2 different answers, and that may take you down completely wrong path or have the
Yeah.
wrong fraud rules or give you the wrong insight about the consumer. So you do need to change your system to support 8, and that has been a struggle for many. Now, the second part of it, how do we actually do it? Well, first of all, it's built for the support of whatever number of digits that you need to do. But then you also see different networks give different level of granularity. So you may get different response from a debit network in the US than you get from Visa. So you really need to operate on both networks. And we do that. So we integrate to all the debit networks, we integrate to all the global networks like your Visa, MasterCard. And you even do that in the US and other countries like Australia and France, etc., where you have nuances that is worth paying attention to for those use cases. And then there's a lot of other information that's important that you can add to the bin data that makes it even more useful. So we have a lot of enrichment APIs that we talked about in our previous podcast together, Jordan, in terms of interesting data points that can be useful for people to be more effective with their bin data.
Yeah, and I'll link that episode in the description. So anybody that listen to this that wants to go back and hear that longer discussion, that will be in the description. One of the things that, so historically, PCI compliance. Let's talk about this a little bit, and you guys can feel free to tap out, and I'll just kind of just work through my thought here. But it was first 6, last 4 we could expose internally because the first 6 gave us the bank and like the level of card, and the last 4 kind of gave us a unique identifier. And I've built some custom searches in the past to look things up using those sorts of combinations, so we would not have like email being shared or any other normal PII data. But what happened is when 8 digits is now becoming a thing, it kind of changes in the hard PCI rules. Do you guys know if anything's changed in those to allow for 8 digits? Because when I was reading it, this was like probably 2 or 3 years ago. My interpretation is you could take 2 from the one side, from the last 4, for example, and add it to the other side. But you couldn't really expose anything in the middle part there unless you took away from the other ones to make it still kind of a lesser identifiable credit card information. So do you guys have any insight into that at all by chance?
Yeah, so the PCI Council, which is the governing body for that, they have actually upgraded the specs. So the recommendation now is use 8 and 4 for, let's say, customer service situation. If you're doing something like lodging, then that is not necessarily the best idea. And in that case, it's better to use the 8 plus something else, let's say your order ID, so that you don't give away too much information for they ever have access to the lodging files. So 2 different scenarios, but both have been addressed in terms of what's the best practice and how you do it. Now, the challenge, I guess, comes with that is different than what people doing before. So that's like, I think, where the friction comes in. But in terms of what is good or what is recommended, that is now clear.
Yeah, because I know for us in the past when I built that, it was people would be calling in through customer service and looking for unrecognized charges transactions. Yeah. And these transactions were made on their behalf, so they didn't know. But we also were tokenizing credit cards, so we couldn't expose full pan. So that way somebody couldn't call in the call center, have the agent type in a full pan because it was going to not return any results on that. We didn't want to store any of the full pan. So we got around it by doing the first 6, last 4, plus I don't even remember what the other thing was. I don't remember what it was at this time. Jacqueline, you were there when we built this. But it worked for us so we could still stay in compliance. We could still find the transaction, and then I still got the data that I needed to do my job on my side. It was really interesting, but I remember like we were going back and forth on the 8 digit, what was going to happen. So with 8 digits, is that on all networks or is it on any specific network, like just Visa or just MasterCard, or is it everybody doing 8 digits now?
Coming from you, it could almost be a trick question, but I'm gonna say yes. It's the same across all the networks to keep it simple. So
Yeah.
Yeah. Jacqueline, do you have any other information you want to tell us about 8 digit bins?
No, I do think you have to, unfortunately, bin lookups are things that people coded and forgot about.
Yeah.
So
Mm.
finding where it's important in your system, it's going to be tricky, but you need to go look because some clever developers you may have chosen to check the bin in several different places for multiple reasons. So as you're looking at your um, authorization and acceptance, sometimes you check the bin when someone adds a card. Sometimes you check the bin between the add a card and the usage of the card. Sometimes you check it after for fraud purposes. So you just don't know where your fraud lookups might your bin lookups might be. And as this change is happening, you need to make sure you're calling your services properly. So anyway, just do an audit is all I can say and have someone technical do that for you.
And I think you bring up a good example, Jordan. I think it's pretty straightforward on paper, but then you add your infrastructure, which obviously can be very complicated for some merchants, and then one or many vendors that are touching that and maybe changing what is possible. And you give a great example there. So I think that is where it gets a little bit complicated. Limitations on your systems or your vendor systems, or it doesn't get upgraded. There's plenty of people that haven't upgraded for the 8-digit standard change, which means their whole operation is sort of fluffy now versus being more precise. And that obviously doesn't help the end result. So,
And the international is another side of it, right? So the issue of making sure you're truly identifying international banks, especially in the business I'm in, is working internationally, right? So they are equally important in the foreign cards to the local domestic cards. So just making sure that you also are up to date on how you're looking at that and in your databases. So as you receive the data you now store can be different, which most people are storing only 6 and 4. Yeah. So
Yeah.
Jordan was making.
Yeah. I would say I all of the free bin lookup services I used to use seem to have been shutting down when 8 digits came up. Uh, but I know that like I could use like 4 different services and I'm gonna get a different answer 3 at a times on those,
yeah.
of what that bin is when I put in these days. I think the international piece is especially as businesses are more international than ever before, like it just seems like almost everybody that I hang out with at conferences, like they used to do domestic only, are now doing international. And it's such a different beast uh, than just worrying about easy domestic traffic that you definitely need to make sure you're having accurate data because you could have one to say Bank of Singapore, but in reality it's, Wells Fargo, Canada or something. I don't know. But
Yeah.
let's talk about what else comes with doing these sorts of and identifying these types of cards is the fees that come with them. So paying for premium cards, paying for different fees related to how much information you're sending. So if you guys, I don't care who starts, either one of you guys start on like what like the different fees that break out on different card types known from these types of pins. Things like downgrades. What is a downgrade? Why am I being downgraded? I bought that ticket in first class. Why am I now sitting in economy? Tell me all about these sorts of penalties, everything if you could.
I can't help you with the flight upgrade, but
Yeah.
a little bit about surprise fees on your statements. So I'll do a quick uh, thing, class, and then I'll leave this to you because this is an area where you can provide a lot of value to the listeners. But I can express the problem in spades. The challenge is that your pricing on your statement, if you are not at simplified acquirer pricing, is very complicated. Every card that comes to you has a different interchange. It's all in a very long schedule, one from Visa, one from MasterCard. And so as you look at your fees, you need to understand what kind of cards you're getting. So, are you getting predominantly credit cards or predominantly debit cards or a lot of prepaid, which has grown dramatically in the last few years from being almost irrelevant to this conversation to being very relevant? And so, you do have to know what types of cards you're getting, what types of fees those have. Prepaid has actually higher interchange often than debit, which is a surprise to most people because it is a debit card, but it isn't regulated. So, anyway, just know what types of cards you have and what types of fees go with it.
I didn't
The
know that.
commercial cards being extra interesting, they have generally the higher fees, also higher purchases, and an ability to offset some of that increase in fees with level 2 and level 3 data, which you mentioned. And so all of that is just a matter of learning what your profile is of your customer base and how many of these cards do you normally get and what kind of fees should you be expecting. But the concepts of level 2, level 3 data and downgrades is really where I wanted to focus, which is um, there's one thing of like doing the best you can to get the standard rate and qualifying for the best rate you can. That should be how everything's built. The problem is sometimes you're not optimizing the data you're sharing with the network. And it can be as simple as when you set yourself up to to add a card, tokenize it, and then pay with the card, that you are not either classified as the right merchant code. So you're getting
Mm,
downgraded every time. You might not be sending as much, you might not be sending the CVV on that second on the authorization, because when you tokenize the card, you didn't keep the CVV because you're not allowed to.
that's right.
So there's lots of things that can happen in your setup and the way that you've done things that all of your transactions are not qualifying for the best possible rates that you could get. That's a circumstance where you should work with your acquirer and find out why you're getting downgraded and
So
go specifically through the message to learn what you're missing.
what does downgrading in the simplest term actually mean?
Sure. Yeah, there are two interchange rate. One is for clean traffic, one is for not clean traffic. That is the
Oh,
simplest way to put it.
And,
So if your data isn't good, you're getting downgraded.
and the delta of that could be quite material, like 100 basis points and stuff. So there's a lot of money there if you don't do it right, that you need to pay attention to. So I guess step one is even identify the row where you see your penalties and realize that you could do something about it. To Jacqueline's point, the data you send or don't send actually change the outcome from a cost perspective.
do they specifically say in the billing like downgraded traffic, or is it called something? Does it have a special name?
Yeah, I mean, it should say if you have a good partner, if you start that way, it should split it up because it is not in change. It is an additional class. So,
Oh, okay.
assuming you're using one of the major players, then the answer is yes. They can make it harder or easier to identify that, but the information is there.
Okay, so
Yeah,
they
there
have
are.
to break it up. Okay, go ahead, Jacqueline. Sorry.
Well, that's all right. So there are also what I call insult feeds, where you're accused as a merchant of insulting the network. Sorry, so they're not insulting, but like insult feeds, which means if you are over authorizing a card. So if your retry strategy is such that you're hammering a card, or the customer is going back and forth and hammering their card, and you don't stop them, they're both of the networks, that Visa, Mastercard in this circumstance, have penalty fees that
Yeah.
go with abusive auth. That's called abusive auth. So it's pretty obvious if you see that charge, then you see abusive auth, you're abusing the system. That's a bad thing. Let's stop doing that. Yeah. And you can ask your acquirer to explain exactly what the rules are around abusive auth. And you can stop doing that by putting a limit on how many times someone can retry their card in a short period of time. So there's several that they have been very clear. Like, you read the description, it's clear that you're getting a penalty fee here and that you should stop, because it's called abuse, it's called a penalty, it's called all kinds of things that works for the English language. Yeah, that says this is obviously something I've done wrong. I'm going to fix it. The harder ones to catch are where you're simply qualifying for lower interchange because your MCC is not accepted, or so you'll often see that you're at basic interchange or some descriptor that isn't the merit or optimal. And so sometimes you'll be lucky and you'll see some of your transfers qualifying at one lower rate and some of your transactions qualifying at a higher rate. And you can look at the names of those two things and figure out that one of them's bad and one of them's good, and ask your acquirer how to get all your traffic into the goodness. Yeah. So I do think there are structural issues your acquirer has to help you with, your processor has to help you with. And then there's these insult fees or abusive system fees that you have to look at your statements in order to catch.
Yeah.
So I think if you think about it as behavioral fees or penalties, that's probably a good start. It should be noted in terms of behavioral fees. Depends also what you optimize for. In some cases, yes, the card schemes are actually quite good on monetize some of these things, and I do get a fee for it, but I'm optimizing for revenue, not cost. So I'm actually going to go through with retry it several times, as an example. That happened all the
Yeah.
time. So it depends on what premises do people also prioritize optimization, not just revenue versus cost.
So there would be time when it would be expected, like for me to see those sorts of things. Like some companies, that wouldn't be the goal to get everything perfect. Some of them, they would expect to see some sort of dirtiness in their statements.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. The other thing I would say, broadly speaking, this is up on you, the acquirers or the PSPs. Everything is fine as far as they're concerned. They're just passing on the fees. So I don't think their interests necessarily are aligned to keep an eye out for you
Got it.
when it comes to this. This is really up to you as a merchant to manage. It's there. If you choose not to do anything with it, likely your vendor is not going to call it up for you
That's
either.
That's funny because I've had those conversations in the past where I've got the letter from the network through my acquiring partner, and then they basically said, "Just passing this on. Tell me what you did to fix it." And I've had those conversations with being like, "I feel like it's your job to help us fix it," and they're like, "Nah."
Yeah.
Uh, Klaus, you guys have that thing where you basically audit my fees on
Yep.
Pagos. Does it pick up things like this? Does it show this level data?
Yeah. So we have an analytical tool, and as part of that, or analytical and monitoring, I would say, to really cover the spectrum here. Part of that, one of the major things that people are monitoring or use the analytics for is, of course, getting approval rates through, etc. But the other one is around cost, and that is breaking up all the different fees, classify them, and see these are fees you can do something about. These are fees that you cannot do something about if you keep
Hmm.
it simple, and then calling out things like downgrades. Hey, you have this many downgrades this month. That is actually more or less than what you had before, or you never actually really even had downgrades. So you have done something you probably want to take a look at doing something about it. So we monitor it and we surface it both in terms of, hey, here's the value. Do you care about $200,000 a month in downgrades? If yes, then here is why you have downgrades as a information input, and how you actually do something about it. And sometimes it could be, hey, something changed. Maybe you roll out a code and you were good before, and you just need to go and say, hey, we got to roll that back and fix it because I don't want to have the downgrades, and I shouldn't have the downgrade. It's just faulty code. That could be you, or it could be your vendor, and just keeping track of that. But then in payments, I think a lot of people get surprised. There's a lot of manual configuration. So even ignoring people pushing out code on regular basis, which obviously could be quite a few different places in the stack. You also have Visa Mastercard issuing their bulletins twice a year. And when that happens, people are reconfiguring a lot of things on the acquiring side. And sometimes those configuration gets wrong. So some of our customers are actually monitoring things like, there are new line items in my fees that I have not seen before. Maybe that's for a good reason, but what if it isn't? Then I want to have a conversation with my partner about why did that happen, so that could be rolled back if it was a manual entry or misconfiguration.
Yeah, I'll never forget. I was working in one of my roles as head of payments and fraud, so I won't be giving anything away. But all of a sudden, realized we were getting charged for a network we did not accept. So I'm like, this is interesting. Let's get that taken off somehow. Somehow that is not right.
I think this happens all the time. So I think a surprise to people broadly speaking, as I said before, the industry is not really data driven in our opinion. That's why we exist. If you start being data driven, you realize, hey, there's a lot of things going on all the time. And your lines or whatever you're monitoring are not constant, which also surprised a lot of people. Hey, what just happened here? Why is there a dip? It's like something technical, something somewhere. Sometimes there's an issue, sometimes it's a network, sometimes is an acquirer or gateway or whatever have you, right? So there's a lot of money to be made by paying attention to the details with numbers.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think that's going to be the time for us on this episode. I hope everybody learned something. I know I learned all about downgrades because I have been so confused about that for so long. And then the bins that provided a lot of clarity for me. So, listeners, I hope that did for you as well. If you have any additional questions, again, put your questions in the comments. I'll do my best. I'll link the other episode we had in this. I'll link to Pagos again. Hey, thank you guys for explaining all that.
Of
And
course.
everybody, we'll see you next time on Payments Corner.